tour. We are here at Evergreen-Washelli Cemetery in Seattle, Washington. Behind me is the American Doughboy statue. Quick interesting history about the Doughboy statue is it actually used to be in Seattle, and the gentleman who designed and sculpted this also designed and sculpted the victory statue that is outside the Olympic Capitol in Olympia, and the victory statue that is for the 91st Infantry Division on the Fort Lewis proper. Over there you see my friend Richard from Seattle Civil War Legacy. He is videographing this, so hello TikTok. If you have questions, please put them in the comments. Richard will yell them at me or throw something at my head, whichever comes first, and I'll happily answer them. You got that for you, Richard? Yep. Just find a rock. It's a big head. You can't miss it. So today is National Medal of Honor Day. Now the Medal of Honor actually is not as old as people think it is. It came about in the Civil War, and originally it was not put in the level of importance that it is today. And for example, in one case of Civil War, an entire brigade was given the Medal of Honor just for re-enlisting. Another example would be the fact that anytime someone captured Confederate colors and can prove they did so, they were given the Medal of Honor. So the importance and the symbolic of it has grown over the years. And it wasn't even until between World War I and World War II that they eliminated the peacetime value of it, as two recipients here got their medals during peacetime. Incidentally, Seattle actually has 3 people who got the peacetime Medal of Honor. The other one's buried at Arcadia Cemetery here nearby Seattle. From here, we're going to be visiting 2 veterans to my left, and then 3 more to my right, and the last one is way across the street over yonder, and it's a bit of a trek, so if anybody chooses not to go to that one, I will perfectly understand. It's a bit of a drive, but there's a lot of really amazing history in here. Like I just learned that in the columbarium was the former Guinness World Record holder for oldest person to skydive and live at 96 years old and 63 days. My Uncle Dave is in the audience, and I really hope he can beat that record someday. So with that, I would like to introduce the Washington State Guard, who's going to present the colors, and Mr. David Block, who you'll meet a little bit more later. Interesting. They are only one of 22 states. We are only one of 22 states to have a state guard. Ours is instituted in the Washington State Constitution by our first governor, Governor Stevens. Incidentally, he did it specifically so he could have a militia under his control to help induce the native tribes to signing treaties. One of his very famous tactics was to only have them sign the last page, and then he would write whatever the heck he wanted in the entire treaty. Go, Governor Stevens. So from here, we're going to move to our first symbol, which every Medal of Honor in the cemetery is marked by those white stanchions that you can see. So we'll be moving that way first. It has been a typical Seattle/Washington spring. Please watch your step. There are multiple slick spots. I can't even begin to list how many.
See the box for the balance? Yeah. Okay, so.
mildly famous on TikTok, a whopping 2,000 people. Much like my high school career, mildly famous. So the first veteran that we're going to be visiting today is William Horton. He's the only Marine Corps Medal of Honor recipient in the cemetery. Now the cemetery has 7, which is an incredibly high density, but as you notice there are hundreds of rows of veterans. Hundreds. And they represent wars all the way dating to the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, all the way up to the global war on terrorism, and everything in between. What's really interesting about William Horton, if you'll reference your programs, you'll see that his Medal of Honor was earned during the Boxer Rebellion in China. He's the only recipient in Washington State with that distinction. He served during that time, and his citation is very vague of what he did, but when I looked into it, he actually not only helped build the battlements to reinforce the area they were defending, which is kind of the U.S. Embassy at the time, but he actually went down to the basement, found this flag that had the incorrect number of stars to the states, went over, climbed up to where the flagpole is, and personally raised up the flag. And every time it got shot at, or the pole was taken down, he would put the pole back up. But that is one of the reasons he got the Medal of Honor. Now, if everybody has a program, does anybody not have a program at this time? Because I want to make sure that everybody does. You can see that he originally was from Chicago, and he served not only in the Boxer Rebellion, or they call it the China Relief Expedition, but in the Spanish-American War. So when you look at his headstone, he's actually a little bit mislabeled because it makes you think he's a recipient of the Medal of Honor from the Spanish-American War. But before I say any more about Mr. Horton, I want to bring your attention to something called the tradition of coins. Now, a lot of times you go to veterans and you'll see coins across their headstones. Now, a penny, like this one here, represents, as you can see, that you visited the gravestone and you respect their service. As you can see in there, nickel means you were in boot camp with them. A dime means that you served with them in some sort of capacity, typically in the same unit. A quarter means you were in their unit or with them when they passed. And if you see a 50-cent piece or silver dollar, that is extremely significant because that means that person was with that veteran when they died. And so that is a very rare one to see. But at every one of these, I will always make sure to lay down a penny. Before we move on to the next veteran, I wanted to make sure that we all have a chance to read his citation, because all these men did something rather incredible. And by all means, in between while we're walking, I'll be happy to field any questions that anybody has. Let me get to, there we go. So for Mr. William Horton, distinguished conduct in the presence of enemy at Peking, China, which is now Beijing, 21 July to August 17th, 1900. Horton assisted to erect the barricades under heavy fire. But as I said, not only did he do that, he also went down, found a flag in some footlocker, and ensured that it always flew over the American Embassy. So this is Mr. William Horton, the only Marine recipient in this cemetery of the Medal of Honor. Before we move on, I'll make sure that everybody has a chance to see, because the cenotaphs you see here that mark where they're laying was actually paid for by the cemetery. Now, they originally were going to do all the Silver Star recipients, but there's a lot more of them than there are Medal of Honor recipients. And I was told one of those costed a few $1,000s a piece, so you can imagine putting up 60, 70 Silver Star recipients versus 7 Medal of Honor recipients. It gets pricey very fast. If you're watching on TikTok, hope you're enjoying this. Please put your questions, comments into the comment box, and my videographer will let me know when there's something he needs to be brought to my attention. I'll happily answer it.
What's the difference between the Silver Star and
the Silver Star is one of the top 5 medals, but the Medal of Honor is the highest distinction of valor, bravery, and courage that can be bestowed upon any member of the military. Incidentally, some fun facts with the Medal of Honor: there is one woman who's ever received it, Dr. Elizabeth. She was a Civil War doctor and actually was taken away from her from a time. But I happen to know for a fact there is an Army nurse in World War II who is actually going through the review process to have her Silver Star upgraded to the Medal of Honor right now. And the only reason I know that is because I'm helping with that effort.
What's her name?
I'm actually going to withhold that because I don't want that to get out to just yet.
Okay.
Hi there. Hey, I brought that GHQ book. It's in the car. I'll have to show it to you.
Oh, okay.
If we're still,
Okay,
still
yeah,
here
yeah.
at the end
Sure.
together.
So after this, we talk about this recipient, we will be making a hike. So I hope everybody brought their appropriate shoes because it's a ways. But as we move through the cemetery, pay very close attention because a lot of these brothers and sisters in arms, you'll notice where they served, they died in combat. A vast majority of them, somewhere, the cemetery estimated between 12-ish% of all the veterans here died in combat. That's a really rough estimate. I don't have the exact numbers, it's been hard to do. But here we're talking about Private First Class Louis Albanese. He is a true Italian American, having been born in Venice, Italy. He immigrated when he was very young to the United States, and actually, for a time after he graduated high school, worked at the Boeing factory until he was enlisted or drafted into the Army when he served in the Vietnam War. He was killed in action. He is one of 3 Medal of Honor recipients that we're going to be visiting today who were killed in action. 2 of them from Vietnam and 1 of them in World War II. You'll notice that he actually went to Franklin High School. Are there any Franklin High School graduates here by any chance? Nope, didn't think so. I think the cold weather snapped a lot of people from wanting to come out. I can't blame them. You've got to do 5 baseball games tomorrow, and that's not going to be fun. I kid. But his was actually one out of necessity. He, after his background, he chose to go in and he actually embraced the lifestyle quite a bit. But his citation talks a little bit more in detail than I can give. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life beyond the call of duty, PFC Albanese's platoon, while advancing through the densely covered terrain to establish a blocking position, received intense automatic weapons fire from close range. As other members maneuvered to assault the enemy, PFC Albanese was ordered to provide security for the left flank of the platoon. Suddenly, the left flank received fire from enemy located in a well-concealed ditch. Realizing the imminent danger to his comrades from this fire, PFC Albanese fixed his bayonet and then moved aggressively into the ditch. His actions silenced the sniper fire, enabling the platoon to resume movement toward the main enemy. A quick note there, it's estimated he actually took out 8 enemy snipers with his bayonet in hand-to-hand combat or close-range firing. As the platoon continued to advance, the sound of heavy firing emanated from the left flank from a pitched battle that ensued in the ditch while Albanese had entered. The ditch was actually a well-organized complex of enemy defenses designed to bring a devastating flanking fire on the forces attacking the main position. PFC Albanese disregarded the danger to himself, advanced 100 meters along the trench, killed 6 of the snipers who were armed with automatic weapons. Having exhausted his ammunition, Albanese was morbidly wounded while he engaged 2 more enemy fires in fierce hand-to-hand combat. His unparalleled action saved the lives of many members of his platoon who otherwise would have fallen to the sniper fire from the ditch, and enabled his platoon to successfully advance against the enemy force of overwhelming numerical superiority. Albanese's extraordinary heroism and superior dedication to his comrades were commensurate with the finest military tradition service and remained a great tribute to himself, his unit, and the United States Army. So this is the second recipient of that, and as I said, at every one I will be placing one of the coins. But please take your time. We're actually going to be moving up towards the chime tower, and I'll talk a little bit about the chime tower when we get there, because that's one of the very few War of 1812 monuments in the entire state up there as well. So at this time, go ahead and plug in the power pack. So take a few minutes, and then we'll be moving directly through. As you pass through the cemetery and the headstones, make sure you walk in between them so you don't actually step on somebody, quite literally. So any questions or comments?
I'd just like to mention about
Not much of it.
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Is a lot of his classmates from Franklin High come out here on Memorial Day. It's pretty dang touching to see that, even in the last few years. They called him Louis. The teachers at Franklin High School just said he was overall just a upstanding citizen, were the words used by his teachers. And I have had the pleasure of meeting his sister and some of his cousins.
I think I should explain, Mr. Block here actually leads a Memorial Day walking tour as well, around Memorial Day time frame.
How old was he when he?
And that's the very touching part.
He was 24?
He was only 20.
20.
He was only
20
20.
years
Wow.
old when he gave his
Oh,
life.
it was Lacey who was
24 or 26.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you're ready, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be moving directly this way.
Here, do me a favor.
Yeah.
Let me hand you this while we're walking. My hands are frozen. I need to put them in my pockets a little bit. Check your comments and stuff.
Just for the record, we are not live streaming a funeral. We are visiting Medal of Honor recipients who are resting in Washington State, particularly at the Evergreen-Washelli Cemetery in Seattle, Washington. I would never live stream a funeral without family's consent or if it was one of my own family members. So where we're walking to now, right here, is the chime tower, which was a prominent fixture and still is of the Evergreen-Washelli Cemetery. What's interesting about it is I just talked to the director, and he said that in the next couple of months they are going to start the overall reconstruction of it and repairs. So as you can see, the cemetery, once called the Arlington of the West, is littered with hundreds upon hundreds of veterans who are resting here, ranging from wars all the way from the Mexican-American and Spanish-American wars all the way through to the War on Terror. Thank you all very much for the likes and any gifts you're sending. Really appreciate it. It helps me take care of this and continue serving as the wandering historian. Sorry, I want to point something out real quick. Sorry. As we walk, I will be pointing multiple things out, but you can see over there, we actually have Spanish-American War veterans here. I'm not sure exactly where the Mexican-American War veterans are, but there are some in this cemetery. You'll see a lot of World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam veterans. If you see a World War I with the Aero Squadron, AERO, those are actually the precursor to the United States Army Air Force, which is the precursor to the Air Force. So they are the earliest establishment of what would become the Air Force. There's the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Aerial Squadrons, and there is a couple of veterans along the edge here as we walk up. So do pay close attention to some of those headstones. You will see those veterans who are part of, essentially, the very first Air Force of the United States. Incidentally, the first aircraft of the United States for Air Force were balloons. They were used by the Field Artillery and Signal Corps, and you literally set some poor schmuck up in a balloon with a megaphone who, with your bright balloon, would just get shot at until they got brought down, yelling directions for the fire of the Field Artillery. Usually it was the guy who pissed off the commander the most. You good with your hands?
Yeah, better now.
The other thing to note is, like right here, every section of this cemetery for the veterans is noted by like the Battle of the Bulge. Sections over there. The Coral Sea section is around here. They're sectioned off like this to help family members and other people navigate the cemetery a little faster, but also to pay respects to the American military history that is just littered throughout this cemetery. For example, here's one of the Aerial Squadron veterans I just mentioned right here. This is one of the first actual, what would become the Air Force of the United States. These are some of the veterans I was talking about. They're Aerial Squadron. So if you ever flew for the Navy, the United States, anything like that, the Air Force, these are the ancestors to that service. The other thing to really pay attention to, and if you have any questions about them, is the symbols on the graves. The crosses generally mean Christian, but every now and then you'll see a Star of David, or you'll see a Canadian maple leaf. There's a lot of Canadians buried here who served in World War I and World War II. The gentleman over there, please watch out, we do have some cars going on, came from Norway. A lot of immigrants, as you just noticed by Albanese. He was born in Italy. A lot of immigrants are buried here as well. Another really interesting one I like to point out is every now and then you'll come across one of the nurse corps members. Now, this one's a little bit more special because she actually has the women's service medallion here on her tombstone as well. But it's really interesting to see that the nurses are remembered just as well as those who actually fought in hand-to-hand combat, because as I've come to understand, just because you're not in direct combat does not mean you're not in combat.
You want to answer real quick?
Yeah, what's the question?
Question is, were these all killed in action? I'm gonna have to repeat some of these.
No,
times,
they were not all killed in action. Only 3 of the Medal of Honor recipients that we're going to be visiting today were killed in action. A rough estimate would be about somewhere between around 12%, maybe 15% of those resting here were killed in action. You would have to go through and look at each of their headstones to understand that. So, you might want to get off the road here, ladies and gentlemen. There is a funeral going on today, and I'm purposely directing how we're walking to avoid that as much as we possibly can. So these are actually quite special. These are actually from the USS frigate Constitution. These are actual cannons that would have been used on that frigate, and they were donated here. As you can see, the details are right here, and they were donated here. But these are the USS frigate Constitution. You see here, was launched in 1797. One of the oldest ships that served continuously in the United States Navy. So these are what they would have been firing. Down here, after they cleaned it, rammed it, gunpowdered it, and then put the ball down and rammed it again, you'd have, this would actually be open, but it's, to have a gun on display like this, they have to be decommissioned. They can no longer be military capable. Just like the weapons down there at the lower end of the cemetery, they have to be no longer military capable. They would have a hole here where the fuse would be. They would take that hot wick, light it here, connect the propellant, launch the cannonball. So what's amazing is my Uncle Dave actually saw these in action at one point. Wow. So where we're walking to now is the chime tower. The chime tower is kind of the centerpiece for the cemetery of the veteran section, which is where we're obviously walking right now.
Dave, do you know any specifics on the larger artillery piece down there? I know the 1898 one is from Kirkland, and that was the Spanish-American War one, but, which I didn't know.
As far as I know,
I don't even know, is that Vietnam era or Korean War? Like, what's the
thing with artillery is they can be used for decades before it's rendered inoperable due to technology.
Yeah.
But most of those are either captured or donated pieces that are demilitarized.
And what I have a recollection that there were fundraisers between veterans groups and I believe the Seattle Police Department that helped procure that artillery piece down there.
And maybe just a quick reintroduction. Where are we?
Oh, thank you for asking that. We're actually at the Evergreen-Washelli Cemetery in Seattle, which is a little bit north of the heart of Seattle. And it used to be known as the Arlington of the West, as you can note from all the veterans' headstones around me. And where we are in particular is called the Chime Tower. And what's really amazing is I just learned today, before we started walking, is that this is going to undergo a massive restoration here in the next couple of months. And they hope before the year is out that it'll be open again to the public. Due to years of vandalism, neglect, and other various things, lacks of funding, it's happened to the way it is. I actually think it looks kind of amazing with the vines on it. But this is the Chime Tower, and what it's designed to do is to annotate everyone who's buried here. Now, there's one thing in particular I didn't mention, but Richard's going to talk about that, so I'm going to leave that for him here in a few minutes. This right over here to my left, your right, this is one of the very few War of 1812 monuments in the entire state. There are very, very few veterans of the War of 1812 buried in this state. In fact, I'm only aware of 2. But, as you can see here, they have them listed here, where they're from, which county, and on the opposite side, they have even more listed in what parts of the military they served in. New York militia, Vermont militia, things of that nature. But you can see, this is where they served, and this is where they're from in Washington State. One of the very few of War of 1812 monuments, and that's particularly because Washington wasn't a state yet. It wasn't a state until 1889, and so they were actually coming from the territory when we were still forming and trying to have enough of a population to warrant becoming past the territory into statehood bid. So with that said, we're actually going to proceed right over to our third veteran here. Now something to note here is that you will see a very high preponderance of those killed in action in this particular area. And the area we're heading to is actually almost dedicated entirely to the 442nd Regiment. If you don't know what that is the Japanese American Regiment, which remains the most decorated military regiment in the United States history. But do take some time before we leave this area to look around, because right over here we have all the Medal of Honor, most of the Medal of Honors that are resting in Washington State. And on the chime tower, all of the symbols on here represent the veterans in here. And it's all over the chime tower. The one I really want to point out, and if you ever get to Cle Elum, Washington, it's in the middle of nowhere, quite literally. If you're there, you're I looking for it, or B, you got lost, is Douglas Moreno. Douglas Moreno is the only recipient from the Medal of Honor from the United States Coast Guard. And he is resting at Cle Elum, Washington, because that's where he graduated high school from when he came down from Canada. Any questions coming from the TikTok area?
Nope. Nothing new.
How are we doing the numbers?
Okay.
Oh, good.
About 110 or 20 the whole time.
Hey, just want to say a quick note to thank you all for the likes. Thank you for the comments, the questions. I really love it. Really love helping to hearing this from you. Keep hitting that like button, that follow button, and you'll see more great content like this. And don't forget Seattle Civil War Legacy. They're on TikTok and Instagram. And you cannot forget the gentleman right over there. He's from Washington State history. If you like Washington State history, he's your guy.
Hey, Evan, I'll ask a question.
No,
Yes.
There's a Monroe Hall at Washington State University.
Because he briefly attended there studying as a musician.
Oh.
But you didn't think I knew that, did you? It's not just Star Wars knowledge in my head, folks. There's actual knowledge in there. Although Star Wars does play pretty heavily in there, along with Batman. And if you don't like those two things, well, I don't know if we could be friends. So this one is really special to me because the 442nd, I've actually had the privilege to meet two of their veterans and shake one of their hands. It's an amazing, amazing unit. Now, a lot of historians will tell you, oh, they volunteered out of the internment camps. Completely not true. They were voluntold that this was a way they could prove their citizenship. Now, he was drafted out of Minidoka. Minidoka is located in Idaho, but believe it or not, the very first internees in World War II came out of Bainbridge Island, Washington, and the exhibit that's there is considered part of the national exhibit at Minidoka. Now, these are areas that they're in literal nowhere, so they weren't endangering the American population. The closest internment camp that we have is actually in Puyallup, Washington, on the state fairgrounds. It was called Camp Harmony. A couple of years ago, they actually just dedicated a memorial to that particular instance. Now, William Nakamura was part of that group that basically had to prove the rights that they were going to be good citizens, to prove their loyalty to the United States. In fact, the author of a book called The No-No Boys is buried in the vicinity out there. And the No-No Boys are referred to that because there was actually 2 trick questions on the citizenship loyalty test that all the men of Japanese American descent had to take. And if you answered no to both those questions, well, then I guess you were a spy, and this was one way to prove you weren't. So he was actually born and raised in Seattle and spent a lot of summers at the canneries in Alaska. He was not born in Japan. He probably didn't even speak Japanese, like many Japanese Americans. They didn't speak Japanese anymore. They were American, flat out. In fact, the only state where there was a high density of Japanese Americans that did not get interned was Hawaii, because how do you intern a third of your population? A third of the population fit the parameters of the executive order to be interned. William Nakamura, on the other hand, well, he was singled out pretty quickly. Attended Garfield High School. Any Garfield High School graduates? Hey! Yep. He actually, like many of the veterans, he actually has a courthouse in Seattle named after him. The federal courthouse is named after Nakamura. And there's actually several places on the bases and throughout the city and the state named after all these recipients. But this was his chance to prove his loyalty, so after he left Minidoka, he enlisted and was joined the 442nd. Much like the Buffalo Soldiers, they did not put Japanese people or Japanese Americans in charge of that as the officers. They could be enlisted, but they couldn't be officers because A, they didn't want them to rebel against the United States and turn against them, and B, they actually felt like the Buffalo Soldiers that the minority was not capable of the rigors of leadership, which, hey, racism. If you don't like U.S. history, you're not going to like it after you learn about racism. So Nakamura actually was upgraded to the Medal of Honor only in 2000, and that was when they upgraded a lot of people to the Medal of Honor from the 442nd. So his citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Private First Class William Kenzo Nakamura distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism in action on 4 July 1944 near Castellina, Italy. During a fierce firefight, Private First Class Nakamura's platoon became pinned down by enemy machine gun fire from a concealed position. On his own initiative, Nakamura crawled 20 yards towards the hostile nest with fire from the enemy machine gun, barely missing him." When they talk about that, he's crawling on his stomach and it's maybe a foot or less above his head. So, again, my big head, I probably wouldn't make it very far. That's how I am. He quickly, from reaching a point about 15 yards from the position, he quickly raised himself to a kneeling position and threw 4 hand grenades, killing or wounding at least 3 of the enemy soldiers. The enemy weapon silenced, Nakamura crawled back to his platoon, was able to continue its advance as a result of his courageous action. Later, his company was ordered to withdraw from the crest of the hill so that a mortar barrage could be placed on the ridge. On his own initiative, Nakamura remained in position with his to cover his comrades' withdrawal, while moving toward the safety of a wooded draw. His platoon became pinned down by deadly machine gun fire. Crawling to the point where he could fire upon the enemy position, Private Nakamura quickly and accurately fired his weapon to pin down the enemy machine gunners. His platoon was then able to withdraw safely without further casualties. Private Nakamura was killed during this heroic stand. Nakamura's extraordinary heroism, devotion to duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service, reflect great credit upon him, his unit, and the United States Army. It's symbolic because he and a couple other veterans were technically immigrants to a degree. He was a Japanese American who was an enemy, an alien in his own nation. His own citizenship was essentially revoked, yet he still went forth and did these things. And that's what really impresses me about Nakamura. Now, for this next part, I would like to introduce Richard. Richard runs a program called the Seattle Civil War Legacy. Now, the reason why I'm introducing Richard is if you look less than 10 yards away, you see a little cenotaph. I'm going to let Richard take it away from there.
Well, hi guys, I'm not going to take too much time from Evan here, but what I specialize is the history of the American Civil War and its relation to Seattle via the veterans. Of course, the war didn't take place here. There were no great campaigns or battles or contending forces here in Washington, but in its formative sort of decades of Seattle, Tacoma, in all the Pacific Coast cities, veterans of that conflict are an enormous part of our history. There's only 3 veterans of that conflict that are buried in this with the upright headstones in the Veteran Cemetery, because it wasn't established until 1927, and most of the veterans of that conflict that are buried here died before 1927. So when we go out of here into the more historic parts of the cemetery, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of men who fought in the American Civil War. Veterans of Gettysburg and Vicksburg and the March to the Sea, and any possible aspect of that conflict is represented in the stories of veterans elsewhere in the cemetery. One of the most significant is this monument, and this is in fact a monument. This is over his grave, but as we'll walk over here and we'll see a monument to a man named Hiram Gale. He was the last surviving veteran of the Civil War here in Washington, here in Seattle. He lived until 1951. The conflict ended in 1865. So Hiram Gale was quite a celebrity here in Seattle. This is his portrait. This bronze medallion was sculpted by a very well-known Seattle sculptor, James Wen. This was originally in the Seattle Armory building, which used to be right on the north end of the Pike Place Market, until that was torn down. So this monument, he is buried here, but this monument was erected 1953, 2 years after his death. On the back side, you can see who put this monument here. And that's why we can tell that it's a monument and just the largest gravestone in the vicinity. It was established by descendant organizations. So Union Civil War veterans had an organization called the Grand Army of the Republic. Their Grand Army is responsible for Memorial Day and a lot of the patriotic traditions that we have in American culture. He led that organization on a national level in the late 1940s. After World War II, he was the commander of this organization of surviving Civil War veterans. He was one of the very, very last Americans standing who had carried a musket during the American Civil War. That organization kind of has lived on to some degree in the Sons of Union Veterans, the Women's Relief Corps, the Daughters of Union Veterans. They're all listed on the back. They're the ones who put this up here in 1953 to honor his memory, and they put this bronze plaque on. So he's the last of all of them in Washington, and he was one of the very last in the country. And while this cemetery is full of Civil War veterans, I really like to bookend, when I do tours here, I talk about this, him being buried in 1951, the last to survive, in the the Washelli Mausoleum, which we'll pass on the way to the next, in the north, I guess, passage or whatever it's called, is the very first Union veterans who arrived in Seattle. He arrived in the early fall of 1865, like the smoke had barely cleared off the battlefield. There's some who arrived in Washington Territory during or just after the war, but he's the first to have known to, I can document, to be in this city, which had about 250 people. It's a village at the time of the Civil War. That he arrived here from the east, having fought against the Confederate Army. So when he, in 1865, to him in 1951, there was continually somebody in the city who had fought in the American Civil War, and dozens of them are buried throughout this cemetery. So this is a special spot in Seattle history, but just anything connected to the American Civil War. He's a pretty significant figure, being one of the last on the earth. Pretty remarkable.
He's one of the last 5 in the nation, to put that in perspective.
Yeah, the last one was 1956. So he was 104 when he passed away, and he worked up until the age of 101. His son, he was a newspaperman around Puget Sound, I think Bremerton and some other places. He started, an editor of newspapers, and his sons were of course real estate dealers here in Seattle, which was a common business for Civil War families and things to be in. And he worked in his son's office until he was 100 years old, actually. So he's a hardy, robust fellow.
Yeah, to survive a war like that, I guess you can do about anything.
Yeah.
Right, so please take a minute to look at both of this, and then we'll be heading over that general direction for Lacey. Hey, everybody who's there on TikTok, thank you very much for the likes, the comments, and everything like that. Go ahead and plug in the battery. The gifts, the likes, the comments. If we don't get to it right away, we'll try to. But I saw something about the Imperial Commander who's buried here. I don't know anything about that, but he's not buried in this cemetery. And for the gentleman who thinks this is cool or disrespectful, we're trying to honor those who have come before us, like veterans like myself. So hopefully you find it more respectful and cool.
Haters gonna hate, as they say.
So it's okay. Any questions?
No, I can answer one real quick. So Joe Sixpack answered a question about the Civil War soldiers moving here to get as far away from the war as they can. I would suggest, I don't want to
go ahead and plug the power in, because it'll pick it up.
Yeah, I don't want to go ahead and take away from what Evan's doing here with the Medal of Honor tour. However, I would suggest my account is Civil War Seattle. That's where we can get into that kind of stuff. So if you want to answer to that question. But no, most of these men came here in the latter half of the 1880s or the 1890s, so often 20 or 30 years after the war concluded. So that's the quick answer to that question.
Where we're heading now is to a gentleman named Robert Lacey. This is a bit of a wonky area that we're going to be walking to, so please watch your step as we head that way. It's not very even footing. But there is a lot of very significant Washington State history here. And I can't remember his name, but the gentleman who discovered, or is credited with the discovery of the Klondike here. So there's a lot of really interesting history here, on top of the world record holder for oldest skydive. Sorry, that's going to be my thing to go to all day, is that guy skydiving at 96 and 63 days. That's just cool.
That still stands. I feel like somebody would go after that record. 96.
Well, the reason why I had Richard mention that is now, you see that symbol that's just above the doors on the chime tower there? That is the actual medal medallion that was given to Grand Army of the Republic veterans. And that's why it's there, is for people like Hiram Gale and the other veterans that are dotted throughout here. As I said, that chime tower represents every war or veteran that is in here who fought in a war. So we're going to move this way directly. Again, it's not very even footing, so please watch your step.
That GAR medal is constantly mistaken for the Medal of Honor.
Oh, the early ones especially.
Yeah, because the early one, it just, the only difference was this like eagle that was on it. And so, yeah, when I have posted pictures of the Grand Army, everyone's like, oh, he's got a Medal of Honor, and he doesn't, but I see why they confuse it. This is a little tough to read with the glare on it. Anyway, the flower lady hasn't been here for a little bit. There's a woman who works at the hospital. Have you met her?
I have.
Yeah.
I've seen her here a couple of times. Just by coincidence.
Yeah.
You know, she's here.
Yeah.
Well over
Pretty cool.
1,000. I don't know the exact number, and the gentleman who does know is not with us right now. He had a family emergency to go to.
When did it open? When did it start here?
Oh, Richard, you might know that. When was the first burial in this cemetery?
The whole cemetery?
I want to say it was when we were still a territory.
I want to say 1884.
18 what?
84 or 86.
Oh,
Yeah.
Something. It was Denny family property. And David Denny, who's buried way over in the southwest corner there, they buried one of their children here. And then after that, it kind of sort of morphed into a cemetery. And then more people bought in and expanded. But it was originally just Denny family property, and they buried their daughter here. And then I think that was like 80.
For anyone who's not
86.
familiar with watching TikTok, the Denny family are credited with being some of the founders of the city of Seattle, like the actual city proper. So, this is Second Lieutenant Robert Lacey. Now, he too was killed in action in Vietnam, and much like his compatriot Albanese, he graduated from local high school. I'm trying to remember from my notes here, but he actually attended the University of Washington. Now, if you go to the University of Washington, I'm not a huge Husky fan, I'm a Cougar fan. There is actually a very large memorial to all the Medal of Honor recipients who have passed through the halls or the classrooms of the University of Washington, to include Robert Lacey, William Nakamura, and probably the most famous, Pappy Boynton, who is a bit of a controversial character himself because he was kind of a, I'm going to do this first and then see if it's legal later kind of guy when it came to how he flew his plane. But Second Lieutenant Lacey was actually from Stockton, California, and around the age of 5 moved up to Seattle, where he spent all his formative years, forming a lot of friendships and bonds and things of that nature. He actually went to the Army Infantry Officer Candidate School. So there's a couple ways to become a military officer. You can be drafted directly into officership. Those are usually doctors, lawyers, or well-connected rich people. You can go to the Reserve Officers Training Corps, which is what I did at many, many universities. Or you can go to what's considered OCS, Officers Candidate School, which is what Mr. Lacey did here. What strikes me about Lacey is that just the day before he was killed in action, he finished a letter penning it home to his dad. So that letter arrived right around the Christmas time, about 2 weeks after the notification that his son had been killed in action. A letter arrives from him that he postmarked the day before he was killed. And that's the one that always gets me, and I did reference that a little bit in the biography that you have in your programs. So with that, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond a call of duty, Second Lieutenant Lacey, Infantry, Company Bravo, distinguished himself while serving as a platoon leader during a reconnaissance mission. On one of his patrols became heavily engaged by the fire from a numerically superior enemy force, well located in an entrenched bunker complex. As Second Lieutenant Lacey deployed the remainder of his platoon to rescue the beleaguered patrol, the platoon came under intense enemy fire from the front and rear flanks. Sorry, correction, from the front and both flanks. That's the right and the left flank. In complete disregard for his safety, Lacey moved from position to position, deploying his men to effectively engage the enemy. Accompanied by his radio operator, he moved from the front and spotted an enemy sniper in a tree in the act of firing a rocket-propelled grenade at them. Realizing there is no other time to escape the grenade or shout a warning, Lacey, unhesitatingly, with full knowledge of the consequences, shielded his radio operator with his body and absorbed the full impact of the explosion. This valorous act saved the life of his radio operator and protected the other men in his platoon who were nearby from serious injury. Despite his mortal wounds, Lacey calmly and confidently continued to direct the platoon's fire. When medical aid arrived, Lacey violently refused attention until the other more seriously wounded were treated. His display of extraordinary courage and exemplary devotion to duty provided the inspiration and leadership that enabled his platoon to successfully withdraw without further casualties. Lacey's gallantry at the cost of his life are in the keeping of the highest traditions of the United States military service, reflect greater credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. That is the story, in short, of Robert Lacey. Again, a gentleman who became called Seattle home, but had moved to this area and built his life here. So from here, we're going to proceed to the walkway here, and then up to our next recipient, where you'll understand why I've asked Mr. David Block to be here. Yeah. Here. Put that in my pocket, please. To the Breeze 66, no, I'm not trying to raise money for the cemetery for the restoration at this time, nor am I trying to raise any money at this time. However, if that's something you're interested in, I will happily talk to the cemetery and see how you can donate to them. Do be careful, the walkway is broken up here, so watch your step, please. I will post a video about the fund for the restoration project as soon as I get that information, and let you know via TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, and all those other places. Yeah, go that way. It's faster to them.
Yeah, a little bit faster.
So, in case you're wondering, directly behind me is the mausoleum that Richard mentioned, where the very first Civil War veteran to arrive in the state is resting. The very first Civil War veteran to arrive in the state. At that time was still a territory. And as Richard just said, the last surviving Civil War nurse is also in there. All right. So at this point, Mr. Block, if you would. At this point, I want to introduce formally Mr. David Block. If you'll notice, the next person in your program that we're going to be visiting is a gentleman named Orville Block. David is one of his sons. And we have the distinct privilege to learn directly about the man who received the medal from one of his children who knew him the best. So he's going to lead us directly to his dad's site and talk about him.
I thank all of you for coming out today, and I'm very grateful that the sun is shining.
So, we are at the Evergreen-Washelli Cemetery in Seattle. Here we are visiting the 7 recipients of the Medal of Honor who are resting in the cemetery. We are on our way to our 5th recipient, a gentleman named Colonel Orville Emil Bloch, who in World War II did some pretty incredible things, as you'll soon learn from his son, David Bloch. And as you'll notice, a lot of these headstones are still indicating veterans. That's why when I was asked earlier how many veterans are buried here, my best answer would be at least 1,000 or more. But everything from the Civil War through the global war on terrorism is probably represented in this cemetery somehow. With a high density of World War I, World War II, and Korean War veterans.
And overall
example,
veterans, I believe there are over 5,000 total, counting the Veterans Cemetery area as well.
That wouldn't surprise me at all. Again, thank you all for the likes, the gifts. It all helps me continue to be the wandering historian and do things like this. This is one of the few tours that I actively lead and work towards always leading every year. Yes, they do still take veterans here. This is an active cemetery. But before David gets a chance to talk, making sure my penny goes down. In case you're wondering, this is Colonel Bloch. As you can see, there's a strong resemblance to David, minus the mustache. Oops, sorry. Now, if you didn't hear me earlier, these cenotaphs right here, they were actually paid for by the cemetery, and they cost a couple $1,000s a piece. Originally, the idea was to have them for the Silver Star recipients as well, but there's a lot of Silver Star recipients in this cemetery. Why don't you go ahead and move closer? I got to charge the battery, so. So Joe Sixpack, yes, they do still take veterans here. I don't know if I'm going to be here one day, but we'll see. Hey, thank you for all the new joins. So, again, I'm introducing David Bloch, who is the youngest, correct?
Yes.
Youngest of Orville Bloch's children, and who actually remembers being at Fort Lawton when it was an active fort. Now, put that in perspective is decades later, that's where I got my first official military ID, was Fort Lawton. It is now Discovery Park, if I'm not mistaken, in Seattle. And it's really a really pretty site. There's a lot of historic buildings. If you give it a chance, great place to visit and hang out for a day. David, please go ahead and let's hear about your dad.
My father was born in 1915, and he was born in Big Falls, Wisconsin. And at the age of 4, his mother died in 1919 in the Spanish flu epidemic. So for about a couple years, his mother's sister took him and the 2 other children for a while his dad, Emil Bloch, reestablished himself, and they moved to North Dakota. And my grandfather was a butcher, and they had a meat packing operation and a store. At the age of 14, in 1929, when the Great Depression hit, his stepmother, my grandfather remarried, his stepmother kicked him out of the house, and he had to go and live on a farm and support himself at age 15. And he worked on this farm and finished high school living with another family, and he would send what money he could back to his dad to help support the rest of his family. Following that, he graduated high school, worked his way a couple years at Swift Packing House in Minnesota, and then joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is a program for young men during the Great Depression. So in a way, I've researched that a bit. I can now say he was in the military before he joined the military, because in the CCCs, young men were given materials by the government, but they built their own barracks, sanitary facilities, and cookhouses to live in, and then they did public works projects and did projects to help grow America and help bring America out of the Depression. While in the CCCs, he met a forest ranger who encouraged him to go to college, and so he went and talked to the dean at North Dakota State University to help him get a loan so that he could get a college education. And the dean was impressed by his self-confidence and audacity and helped him secure a loan. He only had $55 at the time in his pocket, and then he worked his way several years to get through North Dakota State University, and he was in and out of college with financial struggles. And when Pearl Harbor was bombed in December of 1941, he was only a couple credits shy of graduating, and but by February he sought an officer's commission because he was so close to having a college degree, and he sought an officer's commission, but the Army, the Navy, and the Marines all turned him down for an officer's commission because he did not meet the current height requirement for an officer at the time. So he ended up enlisting as a buck private in February of 1942, and then he proved himself, and he went through basic training, and his one of the officers saw a spark in him and realized this guy's a go-getter. He's older than the 18 to 20-year-olds. He's 26, or let's say 27 at the time. So he has a little more life experience. And they noticed he just had a natural leadership quality about him. He was just a born leader. So they put him into officers candidate school, and by October of 1942, he became a second lieutenant in the United States Army. So then we go through another year and a half of training, and he arrives in Italy in May of 1944 with the 85th Infantry Division, with the start of Operation Diadem, which was the final assault on the Gustav Line in southern Italy to break through the German-held Gustav Line that had held up the Allies for 5 months through the whole winter of '43. And most of us do know, that have studied history, we know about the Battle of Monte Cassino, that was just a choke point. And for 5 months, the Allies lost over 50,000 casualties in that battle. The 85th Division was on the coast, though. They were on the west coast of Italy when this final push was made. And then they finally broke through the lines, and they caught up with the troops at Anzio, and then the 85th Infantry Division was the first unit to get into Rome on June 4th of 1944. And General Mark Clark, the commander of the 5th Army, he made that decision. He wanted to get in Rome, and Mark Clark, he liked his glory and he wanted to get some headlines, but he only got his headlines for one day on June 5th, because the very next day, June 6, 1944, D-Day happened, and the Italian front went to like page 10 of the newspapers. So the Germans, they were a very tenacious and determined foe, and Italy was just a slugfest of a battle. It was hill after hill after hill. But from Rome north, it was relatively not as mountainous until you got to the northern Apennine Mountains beyond Florence. And the Germans had set up what was called the Gothic Line. And it was reaching the Gothic Line is where my father had the action that resulted in him receiving the Congressional Medal of Honor. The main Gothic Line was breached September 18th, roughly, by an attack on Monte Altuzzo by the 85th Infantry Division. They broke through, and then 4 days later, they got into a town called Firenzuola, Italy, and beyond Firenzuola were yet again more hills with the Germans dug in. And on September 21st, the U.S. forces, they were advancing, but this German hilltop had an enfilade fire on the advance that was, down in the lower part of a valley, and they took heavy casualties on September 21st. So that evening, my father was called into the headquarter unit, and he was informed that he was the last lieutenant available to lead such an attack up the hill the next day. My sister made a good comment to me this last year that I had never heard, but he said to her at one point that when he went into the headquarter unit that night to report, his feeling was, I'm already dead anyway. And I just find that pretty profound, and I'm sure many soldiers have that thought. And then he's given these ominous, orders that, we're going to attack again tomorrow. But in the meantime, if you have any ideas and could find a better way to go about and getting to that position, let's see if we can do it. Let's talk about this. So they huddled, to use the word, and they came up with a plan, and he recommended that they go off, if he could get 3 volunteers, and perhaps on bellies and elbows, they could go way over and get up on the flank and get up behind the Germans on this hill. And they were able to pull that off undetected at the darkness before dawn on the 22nd. So they got up there, and he left his men behind this big rock, and he went forward, and he went over a terrace and directly into the first German machine gun nest. He leaped over the terrace, he shot the gunner, wounding the gunner, and kicked the big gun into the laps of the other surprised Germans that they did not see this coming at all. And the backside of this hilltop emplacement and village was just a sheer cliff. So the Germans thought there was no way anyone's going to come from that angle, but they did it. They found a way, and they made it up to that top. Following that, he took the prisoners. Those Germans surrendered. They were taken back down the hill, and then he worked his way around the corner of the first large building on the hilltop and spotted the second German machine gun nest. And there's, it's a war, so there's other noises going on, and the Germans were still very early in the morning waking up, or just getting ready for the day. And he saw these Germans calmly loading their weapon, their machine gun. So he threw a hand grenade into the machine gun nest, and it failed to explode and alerted the Germans to his presence. So then there was some fire back and forth. He withdrew to the back side of the building for cover, but his fire had made the other Germans flee and abandon their big gun and go into the building. And he saw that they went into this building, into this room on the opposite end of the building from where he was. So he went in at the back end of the building, trying to find a way, indirect way to the enemy. And it was a large building that was made for multi-family dwellings. So there were walls inside. He couldn't get to those Germans that had gone to that room. Well, he'd made his way to the very front, and while doing that, he was not inside the whole time because there were walls that kept him from going directly to there. So he had to go out, and this building, I visited it last spring for the first time in my life. I was able to go back to this village, and there are these crazily indented doorways alongside the side of this building that you could dive into and take cover. And he did this while a German rifleman from a third building was shooting at him while he worked his way up. And then he did take out that German rifleman as well. But he got to the very front end room, and guess what? There's another wall separating him from that other German crew that had fled into the opposite room. While standing in this room, looking out a window, he heard someone come in behind him. And he said to me one day, my heart went into a tailspin. And he turned around, it was one of his sergeants that were backing him up. So the two of them were at this window at the front end of this building, and right then, coming down this mule trail, was a third German machine gun crew, completely unaware of the recent action, just walking down the trail with the big gun, holding it, just carrying it. So he and his sergeant opened up on those guys, failed to drop a single man, but they all ran into the same room on the other door that these other Germans were in. Then, without a moment's hesitation, my dad just went alone and unassisted, just ran out that door, and then he spoke fluent German. He grew up, he was of German descent, and they spoke German in his hometown in North Dakota. And he ran into that room unassisted, firing his carbine from his hip, screaming and yelling, "Surrender or die," in German. And one German tried to resist. That individual is no longer with us. He expired very quickly. The other Germans were very happy to surrender at that point. They were much more reasonable when this whirlwind came through the door, screaming at them in German and firing the carbine.
For reference, he captured 11 Germans in one room, with I think 4 or 7 more wounded.
Yes.
So
4 were dead, 7 were wounded.
But 11 total were alive and well and captured by one man screaming his head off.
Yeah, yeah. And as his son, I'll just add on a personal note, you wouldn't want that guy screaming at you.
No, you brought something to show us, didn't you?
It's in my car. We'll look at that when we get back to that area. And
Thank you for the roses.
He went on from there and he eliminated 2 more machine gun nests. One he did individually again, and then the 5th nest he was supported by 2 of his sergeants. They eliminated it with hand grenades. By then, though, the German prisoners, and they'd caught an officer, they had rounded up an officer, and the officer just started screaming out to the rest of the Germans on the hilltop, because below the machine gun nests were trenches filled with German soldiers. And the German officer just started yelling out, "Surrender," to the whole position. And suddenly, the whole position surrendered, and 70 Germans were rounded up. And he and his sergeants did not have a scratch. So we talk about that, and I stand here, and what really hits me is that I'm the one standing here being able to tell this story, and how fortunate I am that he lived and that I'm able to be here. I'm just so proud of him and his service to our country. He served until 1970. He had an amazing military career, served on General MacArthur's headquarters during the Korean War, was one of our first advisors in Thailand in the run-up to the Vietnam War in 1959 to 1961. 1956, his name was admitted into the Infantry School Hall of Fame at Fort Benning, Georgia. And the day I was born, he was, and voted by peer members of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, he was serving as the Vice President of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society of the United States of America. The president of the society at that time that he served with was General Jimmy Doolittle, for the fame of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo and the Doolittle Raid. And the chaplain at that time of the Medal of Honor Society was Chaplain Desmond Doss. So it's just, it really hits me when I think about these things. And I really had the pleasure of meeting Desmond Doss Jr., who was here with us last year, and just to meet another son of a Medal of Honor recipient, there's a special bond there that we share.
And not just that, but whose dads directly knew each other. For those of you not familiar, Desmond Doss was highlighted in the movie Hacksaw Ridge. The movie's fairly accurate, except for one major detail. Doss didn't save 75 Americans. He saved over 150 Americans and Japanese in about 14 hours of work, almost in the dead of night. Now, Desmond is someone that we both call friend. I actually met him in Okinawa on Hacksaw Ridge on the anniversary of his dad's actions a couple of years ago. So it hits home when you can be this close to someone who knew someone that intimately with the medal.
And a final thing I'd like to add is that 10 years ago, I did travel to the Congressional Medal of Honor Society convention, and it was in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, because it was the 150th anniversary of the battle that year. And I went to the public events that were offered for public access, and one was a meet and greet with the Medal of Honor recipients, the living recipients. And I went up and to each and every one of the Vietnam era recipients that were there, when I introduced myself and let them know who I was, they just looked at me and they said, "David, your dad was a leader. We came here into the society in the 1970s when we returned from Vietnam. And as veterans from war, your dad was here. And being one of the World War II guys, you know, having the experience and some more wisdom from years, they said to me, your dad helped us on our return from Vietnam. And each of them said something along those lines. And to me, that just, it just means so much. It just shows you the character and the brotherhood amongst the veterans and the veterans of war.
I really, really appreciate David being here. This is the second year he's come out and talked about his dad. It's pretty amazing. So his citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, then First Lieutenant Block undertook the task of wiping out 5 enemy machine gun nests that had held up the advance of a particular sector for 1 day. Gathering 3 volunteers from his platoon, the platoon snaked their way to a big rock, behind which a group of 3 buildings and 5 machine gun nests were located. Leaving 3 men behind the rock, he attacked the first machine gun nest alone, charging into the furious automatic fire, kicking over the machine gun and capturing the machine gun crew of 5. Pulling the pin from his grenade, he held it ready in his hand and dashed into the face of a withering automatic fire towards the second machine gun nest, located at the corner of the adjacent building, 15 yards distant. When within 20 feet of the machine gun, he hurled the grenade, wounding the machine gunner and the other 2 members of the crew. Fleeing into a door of the house, calling one of his volunteer group to accompany him. They advanced to the opposite end of the house, there contacted a machine gun crew of 5 running toward the house. Lieutenant Block and his men opened fire on the crew, forcing them to abandon this machine gun and ammunition and flee into the same house. Without a moment's hesitation, Lieutenant Block, unassisted, rushed through the door into the hail of small arms fire, firing his carbine from the hip, and captured 7 occupants, wounding 3 of them. First Lieutenant Block and his men then proceeded to the third house, where they discovered an abandoned enemy machine gun and detected another enemy machine gun nest in the next corner of the building. The crew of 6 spotted Lieutenant Block the instant he saw them. Without a moment's hesitation, he dashed towards them. The enemy fired pistols wildly in his direction and vanished through the door of a house. Lieutenant Block followed him to the door, firing his carbine from the hip, wounding 2 of them and capturing 6. Altogether, Lieutenant Block single-handedly captured 19 prisoners, wounding 6 of them, and eliminating 5 total machine gun nests. His gallant heroic action saved his company many casualties and permitted them to continue the attack with inspiration and vigor. Now, all that to say, and you heard David get into more detail about it, he was once asked what he did after that action was cleared and sat down, and he said, quote, "I sat down and chain smoked for the next few minutes." So from here, we're going to go to the first peacetime recipient of the Medal of Honor recipients that we're going to be visiting. You can actually see his stanchions there in the far greater distance, straight across. So we're going to move straight across towards his area. Is there anything else you want to add before we go?
There is. I have developed a pretty good friendship with Desmond Doss Jr. this past year, and we've had some discussions. And one thing that we find important, that we came upon 3 points that I'd like to just share here about Medal of Honor recipients that Desmond and I have, you know, come upon. And the first point is, we really want to humanize them. These were men and women, Dr. Mary Walker, that just did incredible things when the circumstances were presented to them. But they were humans. They were people just like all of you and myself. And it's just, we want to humanize them. The second point is that one way we can honor the Medal of Honor recipients is that each and every one of us try to live up to our highest potential possible and try to be the best we can be. And the third thing that we came upon was that we also have a burning desire to get to know them better. And the more you study the Medal of Honor recipients and what they represented and what they're about, it just helps you go forward with your own life. So I thank you for, again, all of you coming out, and we'll continue on to Emil Friedrichsen at this point in time.
Yep. So if you'll follow me, we're going straight down that way. So you can see the stanchions of the last recipient that we're going to be visiting on this part of the cemetery. It is a typical Northwest spring day where you get bursts of sun, which is what we're getting right now, versus the absolute cold. It's only about 45, 48 degrees here. Supposed to get to a high of like 52. Fun. Even in this area here, we have a lot of veterans still resting in the Seattle area and in this cemetery. You heard David Block talk about he thinks there's around 5,000 veterans here. But here is Emil Fredrickson.
Listening to you talk about your dad and the society, it's 100 years before, or 80 years before.
Let me just leave the power pack on, I'll talk loud.
Okay.
It's like a 30%, so
Yeah.
I'm gonna have it on.
But remarkably similar, just the mindset and
Sure.
and everything about it was pretty. I could just hear echoes of it in what you were saying. Is this new? Fairly new?
Yes.
Newer than this?
Yeah.
Okay, I was going to say it looks.
Surprise!
Okay.
Sorry, well they didn't hear it yet.
I'll zip it.
So as we're waiting for the group to join, just again, I want to thank everybody for commenting, liking. No, go ahead and leave that off.
Well, just while you're talking, we'll.
Liking all the gifts really helps me keep doing what I'm doing as a wander historian. Go ahead and leave the power pack in because I'm down to like 30%. I'll just talk very loud.
You got 46. Okay. For a couple more minutes, you'll be all right.
All right. So as you'll notice, as you walk your way here, you'll see dozens of veterans' headstones scattered throughout the area. And David told me earlier he thinks there's easily around probably closer to 5,000 veterans buried here in total, which is quite a lot for one area. But when you think about how this area used to be referred to as the Arlington of the West, it starts to make a little bit better sense. So where we are is at Emil Fredrickson or Fredrickson. There's a couple different ways his name can be spelled, and it's recorded both ways with an E-N or an O-N. He was a water tender, but originally from Copenhagen, Denmark. Now he immigrated here at the age of 17, but like many from Denmark, he'd been on ships nearly his whole life, so joining the Navy just made sense to him. So he joined the Navy and was actually very successful throughout his career, serving aboard over 20 different vessels. But it was on the day of the USS Bennington, which is considered one of the worst peacetime maritime disasters in US Navy history, that the boiler exploded. And due to his quick thinking, Emil was able to save many of his colleagues from that explosion down in San Diego. Now, he actually remained in naval service for a very long time. In fact, retired out of naval service from Keyport, Washington. And that's part where the bases are now today, near Bangor, Keyport, and several other places. They're part of the huge Puget Sound Naval Complex. He went into construction, and for the longest time, after he died and was placed here in 1950, he became lost to history. He was buried with no next of kin, no one knew how to reach anyone, and he was just placed very unceremoniously. That was until the Congressional Medal of Honor Society and a researcher in the United States and here in Washington was able to go through records and find him again and where he was. So in 2016, the Navy detachment from the Puget Sound area came out and with full military honors, placed a new headstone and this placard here for him to always remember him and give him the burial that he was so unfortunately denied when he passed away in 1950. But his citation is very common of a very early 1900s, very early citations of the Medal of Honor. It's short. I've literally seen one that said just nothing but bravery. They're very short. They weren't exactly wordy back then. His citation is serving on board the USS Bennington for extraordinary heroism displayed at the time of the explosion of a boiler of that vessel in San Diego, California, 21 July 1905. Because of his actions, others lived. And the last gentleman we're going to go to, we're going to actually have to go back, and if you want to come, you're more than welcome, but if not, we have to drive to him because he's on the other side of the cemetery, and he's a good 3/4 of a mile from where we are now, if not more. But please take your time to remember Emil, and we will be eventually walking down that way where we have a couple other things to show you and talk to you about. Yes, sir.
I noticed that his marker is engraved in gold. I understood that that was standard for Medal of Honor winners, but I haven't seen all of them engraved in gold.
Because gold leaf doesn't last very long.
That it just more
The weathering, it almost always gets it.
Did they ever find any family members?
Not that I'm aware of. No one has ever been able to find out who his next of kin. Partly probably due to the fact they're not entirely sure how his last name is spelled.
Yeah.
It's recorded in official records as S-O-N and S-E-N. And S-E-N is the one they've decided to go with here. But he's another example how immigrants display the highest characters of military service to the United States despite their status.
Yeah.
However, I will point out, there is one picture of him known. One. It is the one you'll find in your program. And if you can tell me which one he is, thank you. You deserve a cookie. Because no one knows. They just know that he is indeed in that picture. That is the only known photo of him.
I just wanted to add an interesting note is that, he was buried in 1950, and I kind of connect the dots. My theory is that he was buried right when the Korean War broke out. So I think the Navy got a little bit distracted and nothing formal was done at that point. And there was a very small temporary marking for him. But over time, that got grown over with grass. And so he laid in an unmarked grave, basically, until the historians in 2015, 2016.
It was a 2-year project. They started roughly in 2014 and were able to confirm it late 2015.
Yes, and it was the grounds crew here at Evergreen-Washelli, they came out and they started digging down and they found that temporary marker, and it was like really 3 inches down. But it had been grown over all those years, but they found the temporary marker, and then they were able to do this.
Interestingly enough, there's actually one veteran who has the Medal of Honor, and he is Ferrari. I believe George Ferrari, the first Italian American I mentioned him earlier. He is at the Mount Pleasant Cemetery, and he is still missing. They know he's there, but they do not know where. He is the 54th recipient that is resting in this state. This state has 2 living recipients and 54 recipients resting there. I'll take that. So I'm going to grab Richard here because, Richard, if I'm not mistaken, these are a couple Civil War veterans here.
Yeah. So this is Hiram Gill, which John could probably tell you much more about the most corrupt mayor in Seattle history, Hiram Gill.
It was a part owner of the world's largest brothel. It was I believe it was over a 300-room brothel. It was called the Hotel Leicester in later years. He got hit by a B-52 right around World War II, and they tore it down. But it was right next to where the Rainier Tower is, right along I-5. So when you drive in there, you're driving over.
They got hit by B-52?
Yeah, well, remember, Boeing Field was a test field.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, of course. Okay, so it didn't make it to the test field.
In case I haven't introduced him, John runs a relatively new podcast called The History of the Evergreen State. So if you ever want to learn more about Washington State history, because middle school or high school didn't give you enough, very good person to talk to.
That's exactly why I started it. I had to take Washington State history in middle teacher couldn't give one care for it. So I didn't learn a lot, so I had to do a lot of my own, and I'm like, oh, this is fascinating. Why don't they teach us this?
Now, something I...
He was the mayor of Seattle?
Yeah, he was very, very corrupt. Very corrupt.
So much different than today's politicians, right?
Oh, yeah.
They say so he was elected first, and he went into a recall election, and women got the right to vote, and that was women were who fueled his recall election because there was some women of the Temperance Party, the Prohibition movement, got the ability to vote. He was on the completely the opposite side of the Prohibition. Open town, open everything, give me whatever. So the women are responsible for removing him. And then he went back and said, oh, I'm all cleaned up, I'm a good guy, or whatever, and he got elected a second time. And then he was. So he's here. This is his father-in-law, who's a Civil War veteran from Wisconsin.
So something I want to point out is not all veterans have their markers in that traditional sense that we've been seeing. A lot of them are just marked by the flags like you see right here and here, or as you can come see here, it literally will tell you their unit right across here.
The Civil War veterans, there's a huge variety. Some will have a veteran stone, some will have this, some will say nothing, some will just say GAR, that Grand Army of the Republic. There's a whole thing.
It wasn't until like the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, that you see the headstone that everyone's very familiar with start becoming more commonplace. And in a lot of places in Seattle, you have headstones that look like this, where it is that common headstone, but to save space and visual aspects, they laid them flat. Now, what's really interesting is Richard's going to talk about this, but there's two graves in here that are related to the Civil War, but from the different side.
Even in this section, there's a ton of Civil War soldiers here. They all have a different headstone, so you can't. There's no like, oh, that's obviously.
Yeah, so like this headstone here is a good example of them laying them flat. Now, the best reason I've ever found, and Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it disrupts the visual of the cemetery, and so they laid them flat to save space. And right next to us is one of the biggest Seattle Jewish cemeteries as well. What's really, really interesting, has anyone ever heard of Hero Among the Nations? It is an honor that is only bestowed to non-Jewish people by the state of Israel, and you had to do extraordinary service to the Jewish people. Washington State has one of them, and until recently, even the Jewish Society of here wasn't sure where she is. She is actually resting in Lakewood, Washington. There's a Jewish cemetery down there. She was responsible for smuggling Jewish children out of France into Switzerland in World War II. Oh, now I'm trying to remember. I will get back to you with that. I will get back to you on that one. Hero Among the Nations.
This one's pretty fascinating since we're right here. You can see Madison Coleman, again, a completely different style of designation of his Civil War service. His brother, Wilbur, is right next to him here. There were five, this is a very Saving Private Ryan kind of thing, 5 brothers that all fought together for Minnesota. They all survived. Wilbur, the one that
If you can't hear him, he said Wilbur got wounded in the head. Wilbur, who's got the headstone laying flat. So Richard actually is going to take us to see 2 Confederates that are buried here in this cemetery.
Oh, cool. More Gettysburg, too. We're on Gettysburg. I got Gettysburg for you, Dave.
We are at the Evergreen-Washelli Cemetery, 1946 Nana, and it is in Seattle, Washington. It used to be called the Arlington of the West, and we are out here to visit the 7 recipients of the Medal of Honor for National Medal of Honor Day. So where we are now is we're slowly making our way back to the vehicles because we have to drive to see the last recipient of the Medal of Honor. But we have Richard, who's with the Seattle Civil War Legacy, with us to talk about other veterans that are resting here. And we're making our way to a very special veteran who I always make time to visit when I come to this cemetery. All right, so where are they, Richard? You lead.
Yeah, we'll just keep going straight down here. Veterans everywhere.
See, but here's another Spanish-American War veteran here.
Oliver Campbell.
It's actually turned into a really nice day out here,
Yeah,
which is kind of uncommon for Seattle in the spring.
Illinois Civil War veteran there with the flag. He's
You
got
can see
actual upright stone.
the flags indicate usually where veterans are resting.
You can talk to a couple World War I killed in action. We can show them.
I know. We'll get there.
All this is my favorite spot.
It is.
So right here is
This one?
yeah,
Right here?
just this grass
Mm-hmm.
is William McCroskey, Virginia Confederate infantryman, who was buried here, unmarked. I don't have my notes on me, so I don't have much about his service, but he was given by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They would give them a Southern Cross. It looks kind of like a German Iron Cross type medal. And he insisted on being buried in it. So with six feet down or so here in the ground is actual Confederate.
So for those who couldn't hear, you want to say that again, please?
Yeah, so we're just pointing out, military history curiosities. Right under my feet is William McCroskey. He's a Virginia Confederate during the Civil War. And he insisted on being buried with his Confederate Medal of Honor or whatever they called, Southern Cross of Honor, I think they called it. So there's, if you had a metal detector that reached down far enough, you'd find a Confederate military award. Not the Medal of Honor. It's a bad day to make that mistake, I guess, but the Southern Cross of Honor.
Well, we're getting a question. Why isn't he in an unmarked grave?
That's a tough question. There's a lot of unmarked Civil War veterans yet in this cemetery, in other cemeteries, because the family didn't provide for a marker when they were buried, north or south. This is, or any other conflict for that matter. It's up to the family originally. They'll have a temporary marker. Dave referred to that temporary marker that had vanished. McCroskey probably has one. But you can see with all this moss and the debris, they just get covered, and year after year after year, they're just not visible. The cemetery does a pretty good job of cleaning them up, but you can see those ones are disappearing under the moss. The same thing would happen here with that stone. They just go away. That's one explanation. They're eligible for a U.S. government-provided headstone, Union or Confederate veterans, but it's challenging to get them approved, and it's expensive. There's a family of one veteran, Weber Seavey, who he has a flat marker. His family's trying to get him a government marker, which is free, but it costs $1,000 to get the cemetery to install it and to pay for the care endowment. So if the family doesn't have money to provide a headstone, often they don't get them. And then later descendants or historians or organizations will raise the funds,
which you did do for Captain.
Yeah, Captain John Hoyt, the Iron Brigade officer of the Civil War that's in Mount Pleasant, who I believe to be the last officer of one of the most famous regiments of the war to not have a marker on his grave. So myself and, again, it was over $1,000, and the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable, who has descendants of that regiment, brought the funding together to get that. Otherwise, he'd still be unmarked.
Really quick, Peggy, we are at the Evergreen-Washelli Cemetery in Seattle for National Medal of Honor Day. Now, what's really interesting is that even if he did have a Confederate marker, his marker would actually be different than the ones we've been seeing all throughout the day. The reason for that is the Confederates have a triangular top rather than that rounded top. Now, here's the reason why. When they were cleaning up the bodies of the major battles at Vicksburg, Gettysburg, and all those other places, all the Union guys would stop to their smoke breaks, their lunch breaks, and sit on the Confederate graves. So the Confederate workers who were there would come back at night and chisel it off so that, as they put it, the point of a Confederate grave would point their ass one last time. And that's why the Confederate graves have a point to them.
That one might qualify in the urban myth
category,
but I like the story.
That is actually true because I know the guy who wrote the paper on it.
Oh, really?
So we're going to be heading downhill a little bit. There is a path. If you need to take that, please do. But we are going to be heading downhill a little bit. Seattle Slick.
Seattle Slick.
This is a cenotaph for someone that was killed in the Ardennes
Yeah.
in 1918 in World War I.
I
So-
don't know much about that.
I actually do know a little bit about him. I've been learning recently. But this is Thomas Allen, who was killed in the Ardennes battle, 1917. So we are slowly making our way to another Confederate.
He died just after.
No, he died in, Private Harris died in service.
That would answer your question you asked me earlier about, are there any World War I veterans that died? There you go.
Yep.
That's an example.
There are some right here.
And his is different because his
Family.
he's actually in France. So it says on the
He's
thing that
in
he's
France.
Yes.
Yeah, but the other ones just say there's one just over here, just says killed in France. It doesn't
So-
say but he's not here like this one does. So I'm assuming this is like the spot where they
Yeah.
were the ones that were coming back.
So we're looking at this really neat cenotaph. This is actually not a grave marker right here that says Allen on it. This is a cenotaph for a man who was killed in the Ardennes forest, 1917 in France. He is still in France to this day. This is not his grave. It's just a cenotaph to mark put there by his family. So, Richard, where's the next one at? So this is the last Confederate, known confirmed Confederate buried here. And we're kind of hitting some neat highlights before we get to the last Medal of Honor recipient. And this is
Thomas Harris is his name. 11th North Carolina soldier. McCroskey may have had one of these sexton stones, these temporary markers, but you can see it's got hit by the lawnmower a few times. It's not much to be read here. He was a North Carolina Confederate that was a survivor of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. Not only did he participate in arguably the most famous event of the Civil War, he survived it he was in Lane's brigade, which was the Confederate brigade that penetrated the Union line the furthest. So if you visit Gettysburg and you go
the
to
high water mark.
the bloody angle and the high water mark, that's where Lane's brigade was at. That's where he stood on that day on July 3rd of 1863. He was captured there, spent some time in Union prisons at Fort Delaware, returned to Confederate service again. He built houses in Seattle. He was a contracting carpenter later. And just here, just behind me about 50 feet, is a man named Alonzo Cole, who was an officer in the 120th New York Infantry at Gettysburg, fought in the Peach Orchard on July 2nd, witnessed the next afternoon, Pickett's charge. So these guys were on opposing sides of the same stone wall at the Battle of Gettysburg.
It's interesting.
Here in an obscure corner of a Seattle cemetery with a marker you can't even read.
So 2 Confederates resting in a cemetery in Seattle. And like I said earlier, there's a soldiers' home cemetery in Orting that has supposedly 3 to 4 Confederates in an unmarked grave down there. Now the last side visit we're going to make before we make our way eventually to Harry Delmar Fadden is a gentleman over here. Then I'm going to have to get in the vehicle here. Hopefully I don't lose too many of you. Thank you again for staying with me as long as you have on the TikTok Live. So we're going to make our way all the way to over here under the tree. Now the gentleman we're going to visit is actually one of the rarest type of veterans that you'll ever find in any veterans cemetery. This gentleman here, Owen Burns, is a very rare veteran. For one particular reason. He served in five separate conflicts for the United States. I know of 3 men who have done that, and he is one of them. So you have the Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, the Army of the Cuban occupation, the Philippine insurrection or the Philippine-American War, and World War I. What I love about this one is not only did he serve in 5 separate conflicts, but his character, when he's honorably discharged, was described as excellent. So I don't know how you go through 5 wars and come out with excellent character, but this guy did it. Now, at this time, we are going to go back to our vehicles and make our way to Henry Fadden. He is the last person that we see for this. But before we do that, I want to introduce David Block one more time with something very special to show.
I brought with me today a nice photograph of the front and the back of my father's Congressional Medal of Honor.
Oh, wow, awesome.
The medal itself is stored in a safe deposit box, and but I do have this wonderful photograph of it. And
Can you turn it this way just a little bit?
Yeah.
sure. And what many people don't realize is that the back side of the medal has engraving on it, and the top part, right below the eagle, says the Congress to, and then on the star part, it says Lieutenant O.E. Block, Gothic Line, Italy, 1944.
The glare, thank you. Now, I can attest to this because I haven't seen this one, but I've actually held Desmond Doss's medal in my hands. And every Medal of Honor is registered with the Congressional Medal of Honor Society and a couple other societies, and they are marked that way in particular, so they can never be circulated outside of the family unless willed.
Do they all have the location like this?
Some yes, some no.
Doss's did.
Doss's did. Hacksaw, I think it just said Okinawa.
Okinawa.
Yeah.
And my father says Gothic Line,
It does
So-
say
Italy. It does say
does
Italy.
say that.
Yeah. So at this time, Richard, you're going to ride with me, or you're going to drive yourself?
If anyone wants to get a little closer
Okay.
and see it.
So here is the medal one more time. I'm actually going to make my way to the vehicle, and then you can follow me to Harry Fadden, sorry. So I'm walking back towards my car here, and what I'm going to be doing is passing by this. I'm not done with the tour. We just have one more place to go. We just have to drive to him. This is the American Doughboy statue. It's where we started the tour today. It's one of the most impressive statues in the Seattle area. And you can get an idea why they call this place the Arlington of the West. I've been asked a few times, and I will post a video to talk about how you can donate to contribute to the restoration project of the Chime Tower if they have that function available. So we're getting everybody who was able to drive over. Not everybody's able to drive over. As you can see there is Mr. David Block joining us still. It's been really interesting to meet people who are directly descendant of Medal of Honor recipients, because I now get to call a lot of them friend and learn even more about those who have that medal. Still with me are the husband and wife duo that run the History of Evergreen State podcast. If you like Washington State history, heck, if you even just like Pacific Northwest history, his podcast. Where are you located at, sir?
Mount Lake Terrace.
No, not Mount Lake. No, what platforms?
Oh, pretty much all platforms. Apple Music, Spotify, YouTube,
Richard.
Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. I'm on pretty much every one of them. If it's not on there and you're looking for it, let me know and I'll get it added to it. Put the RSS feed on there.
So here we are at the last recipient that is resting here at Evergreen-Washelli. This is Harry Delmar Fadden, the second peacetime recipient. Now I emphasize that because peacetime recipients are very rare. If you didn't catch me at the beginning, they stopped giving peacetime medals sometime between World War I and World War II because, well, that'd be a lot of medals to give out, and after World War I, they realized that this really should be reserved for those who did something absolutely extraordinary in the service to their nation. Not that these guys didn't do that, it's just they needed to set that bar even higher to make the medal what it is today, and that's when you really see that transition. Because a lot of the peacetime medals are prior to World War I, and only a couple, I believe, came after World War I. But he's actually from the Dalles, Oregon. And for a long while lived in Sumas, Washington, but eventually would make his way back to Chicago to live with his mother. Now, what's interesting about him is he served in the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and the Boxer Rebellion, all before he turned 18. So, for all of those people who said I was lazy at 18 years old, this guy proves to you that I was indeed lazy. He had served in 3 wars before he turned 18, which is an impressive feat. Then he went on to keep serving in the U.S. Navy. But that's when he saw an accident while serving aboard the USS Adams. He noticed that a landsman, O.C. Hathorne, fall overboard, but strike his head in the process of falling, which he was pretty sure was either going to render him incapable to swim or absolutely unconscious. And if you're bleeding and the water's off of Southern California like he was, well, what likes blood and lives in water? Sharks. So Harry, not thinking about himself, jumped in and actually treaded water for an estimated 15 to 20 minutes, possibly longer, for the boat to actually make the turn to come back and collect them. He saved Hawthorne's life. And his citation reads, on board the USS Adams for gallantry rescuing O.C. Hawthorne, landsman for training from drowning at sea, 30 June 1903. Now, he would come back and finish out his career in the Navy and leave, but for his actions on June 30th, 1903, he received the Medal of Honor, saving another man's life. With that said, I'll take that, thank you. I want to say thank you to everybody who came today. Thank you to everybody who tuned in on TikTok. Thank you for the people who stayed with me for all 7 recipients. Some of them by choice, others I held hostage. Sorry, Richard. But hey, if you haven't followed me or liked this broadcast, please do that now. And if you have the chance, go check out the History of Evergreen State podcast. He's on social media. And please check out Civil War Seattle. Thank you very much to all my sponsors. I'll be posting links to all their web information. And if you can, want a program, I can help you get that or send you the information for it. Thank you very much, and hope everyone enjoyed the tour. As always, happy wandering.